Hello to everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar on why you should validate your CECL model. You all know that the CECL standards are in effect as of July 1st of 23 for everyone. Some of you on the call may have already implemented or have been early adopters. But if you're not and you're in that last tranche, you're in the home stretch here. And because January 1st, 2023 is fast approaching, and you have to ask yourself, are you ready? And is your model control framework and validation process up to par? An effective model control framework and validation process is crucial to your institution's compliance and risk management function. You can't solely rely on audit to challenge the model. A proper validation of the model needs to be done to ensure that it is functioning properly. So during this presentation, we're going to review CECL readiness and model validation process, as well as considerations and best practices relating to CECL. Our presenters today are Joe Galdo and David Healy. Joe is a director with our Financial Institution Services Group, and he oversees our BSA AML team through the completions of audits, validations, and consulting projects, and for financial institutions of all sizes across the country. His expertise is really on the validations and really using the data and using our challenger models. So that's why in our firm, we have, really put him in charge of helping with other model validations throughout the firm. David is a supervisor in our internal audit and regulatory compliance team, and he's responsible for doing reviews and audit testing procedures for financial institutions to ensure compliance with federal regulations, as well as the accounting and treasury function where the CECL process falls under. So with his expertise in the CECL and Joe's expertise on the validation, we really have a good presentation and a good process built at Mercadien from that model marketing. The slides along with the recording on the webinar will be emailed to you within the next week. Should you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to send them through our chat or the Q&A function, which you should be able to see on the screen. We have some questions that came in with the registration that the team has already kind of put into the presentation, but we'll make sure we address those for those of you who had the questions ahead of time. And what I'll be doing is I'll be policing the questions and either interjecting with the team as they're presenting, or we'll wait till the end to ask that question if we've already passed that specific point. If you are attending New Jersey Bankers Annual Conference, I know we have some New Jersey banks on the line. Next week is their annual conference, and I'll be participating in a cryptocurrency panel. And also we are going to be in the exhibitor hall, so please stop by and say hi. CPEs, so we are offering 1.5 credits of specialized knowledge for the seminar. So to earn that, you need to have logged in using your own link that came through the email. You need to be successfully answering 3 out of the 5 polling questions, and which you need to respond to within 60 to 90 seconds when the poll opens. If you won't get the credit if you're using someone else's link, join only the conference call, fail to successfully complete the polling questions, fail to remain logged in for the minimum of the 50 minutes, or viewing of a recording, all will not give you the CPE. And you are going to be prompted for an evaluation after the session, which then once we get that back, we'll be able to send off your CPE certificate. So with that, I'll turn it over to the team for the presentation.
Thank you, Sal. I appreciate that introduction. And thank you to everybody who's on the call today. Really nice to see some familiar names. Hopefully in the future, I'll be able to say faces and we can in the future get together live, which will be great. I'll start off by apologizing. I know my background may be a bit distracting. I'm sorry about that. I can assure you that my blinds are fully closed and that's as dark as I can make them. With that said, the housekeeping items that Sal just mentioned, please do keep in mind, since we want to make sure that everyone receives credit for attending this session today. So again, please do keep in mind for those housekeeping items related to CPE. But yeah, as mentioned, today we will be talking CECL. We'll also be talking validation and, really how those two topics converge. And, David and I will cover the content, again, with David really kicking us off through his experience and his expertise. And then I'll be rounding us off as we get into more of the validation centric topics. And all the while, we'll try to keep it within the or through the lens of CECL. So with that said, this is our agenda for today. We'll start off discussing some model methodologies. More specifically, we'll talk about the impact of the type of data that's available and the role that data could play in determining your CECL methodology. In addition to just general overview of CECL methodologies and some detail around the considerations and the effect of that decision. Additionally, we'll discuss what the impact is for governance and internal controls. As we move into assumptions, we will cover the management of those assumptions that are built into the framework of your CECL model. As we know, they can have a very material effect on the performance of the model. So we definitely want to kind of cover that topic and hash it out and work through any questions that may come through during this presentation. Documentation, specifically documentation and as it pertains to model risk management. Some of the items that we'll discuss here, again, data quality. This will be you'll hear data a lot. So maybe we can keep a tally on how many times I say the word data. We'll also discuss design. And again, some of the limitations and or assumptions, specifically how they are being documented, how they should be documented. Overall, I think the importance of documentation, which I won't steal the thunder of David, we will get into that. From there, I'll sort of take the lead and jump into some of the more validation-centric topics, as I mentioned. Conceptual soundness. Many of us on the call are aware that conceptual soundness is a foundational piece of any model validation. And the evaluation of the conceptual soundness of your model, is extremely important. So we'll dive into that. We'll explain what that means at a basic level, and then kind of just take a deeper dive into the different components of conceptual soundness, namely ongoing monitoring, process verification, benchmarking, estimates or outcome analysis. Model data, again, a core component of any validation. We'll want to understand how the data is affecting the model, vice versa, and the importance of the data that's feeding into the system or the model that you've chosen. From there, we'll begin talking about estimates or estimation. As we all know, the key difference between the CECL and prior, looking at incurred loss, is now we're looking forward, right? So as opposed to looking backwards, it's more of a forward-looking perspective. So we want to understand what validation activities are designed to assist us in estimating those future losses. Periodic calibration or periodic validation, either way, really just to cover the importance and to understand what the risks are, to not kind of keep on track with that periodic tuning or monitoring of the system, of the model. And finally, we will discuss why validate. Throughout the slides, we will pepper in obviously reasons and we'll support the idea of validation and really just speak to, why it's important and why we think it's necessary in the CECL context, not just from our perspective, but also from a regulatory supervisory guidance point of view. So hopefully, we will kind of pepper that in throughout the presentation, but I think at the end, the point is to just drive home that point to really, if there was anything not specifically said, we'll want to make sure that we state, here's why we believe you should be creating your plan. Hopefully you have a plan in place to validate. That plan may vary from institution to institution, and there could be, valid reasons why. But again, just to understand the importance behind the validation for CECL, especially. And then we'll take some questions. So again, we're happy to have a back and forth and to answer any questions that we can. With that, I will turn it over to David. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. So as we talk through the methodologies, it's important to understand, first and foremost, governance and internal controls as our clients are working through, running parallel with their systems, or they're still working on selecting that vendor. And most of what I've been seeing across the board with our clients is that they're using, a third-party vendor, to assist with the CECL. And when thinking about that, thinking about the financial institutions, you want to understand, you want to think about that the historical controls that you may have had in place on your allowance may not cover when you go live with this model, and you want to think about maybe adding some new controls or enhancing the existing controls that you have. One of them is when the validators come in and they start asking some questions, they're going to want to understand, the completeness and the accuracy of your internal data, external data, key parameters. The validators are going to, look to evaluate the conceptual soundness and mathematical integrity of your methodology, including the appropriateness of parameters and sensitivities. So when you're working on looking at your controls, you want to make sure that there are controls in place that are going to cover this, because the validators are going to be asking those tough questions, and they're going to want to understand this. And then you also want to think about whether you're going to have, whether there's automated controls here, manual controls that, are going to go into it with it. And the most important thing here to understand is that the more complex model that you're going to use at your financial institution, the expectations are going to be higher with the regulators. And we've started to see that with many of our clients is, with the more complex models, the more documentation that's going to go into it, the more information that the validators are going to be asking for, and including the regulators. And as we'll talk a little bit later in the presentation about a formal governance and your MRM. And if you don't have it, you may want to think about developing that model risk management. The basis here with this whole methodology is going to be some economic information. And so you want to think about, whether you're going to be utilizing, national or regional or more local economic information as part of your model. Throughout our clients, we've seen a mixture of both. Some are using regional and local information. Other clients that we have are using a national and regional. So it's really going to kind of understand what type of economic you're going to use. We also see unemployment widely utilized here. But it's important to really understand that the methodology that you're applying for your forecast and under your current conditions, they should work in all stages of an economic cycle. So right now, we as a country are in an expansion phase. So what happens when we, go into that recession or that recovery? Is your methodology going to work at that point? Is your economic information you're using going to work there? So as we can see here that the more complex models, so such as your migration analysis, the more information you're going to need, or even your vintage analysis. So you want to think about whether you're running parallel now, or maybe you haven't started and you're going to start in Q3 and Q4 of running parallel. Now you're just making sure that you have all of the data that you need, thinking about what method and the methodology you're going to use, and then back into the information that you're going to need with it. Assumptions. So probably one of my most favorite things to talk about here. So is it a set it and forget it exercise? I wouldn't say that it is. This should think about interest rate risks, and that, assumptions are being reviewed quarterly. Think about when the early adopters back on January 1 of 2020 adopted, right? And then we all know what happened 2.5 months later, the pandemic hit. So all of the assumptions that they had based their model on at that point, 2.5 months later, they have to revise it. They have to go in and relook at the economic information. Maybe if they were planning on using unemployment, we know what happened over the next couple of months throughout, beginning of 2020 throughout like year end of 2020, where that unemployment number was very high because of the pandemic. And it's, you got to go back and think, like, does it still make sense to use unemployment here? And understanding that there's going to be a significant amount of judgment with respect to the portfolio segmentation, determination of the appropriate loss period. If you're using a third party, as some of our clients do, to develop the assumptions, understand that the third party assumptions, that are the third party that's helping you, these assumptions are management's assumptions and have to be considered in the same light with designing and implementing the internal controls and understanding the reasonableness of these. And as we'll get into a little bit later about documentation. Documentation is going to be key here. So especially with the assumptions, have you documented and have you communicated the assumptions with audit committee, or with your ALCO, depending on the makeup with it? Have you considered other alternative assumptions or outcomes? And if you have, if management rejected them, it's going to be important to document, because when the validators come in, as Joe will talk a little bit later in the presentation, they're going to want to understand, why you're using these assumptions. They're going to want to, ask those tough questions, and that's where the documentation is going to be, key. What we've seen with our clients is that their assumptions are consistent with, let's say, interest rate risk, that, they're using prepayment assumptions, that it's going to look almost identical to their interest rate risk here. Think about COVID, as I brought up, and what COVID has, kind of wreaked havoc on all of the assumptions from the early adopters with it. it's not a simple set it and forget it. It's something where, you're looking at it maybe quarterly for the first, for the first year, or biannual, depending on what your level of comfort here is. And we've had clients that do both. We've had, I've seen it, it's a quarterly review. It could be even a biannual review. And it's important to think that the alignment of these assumptions should be defined in your model risk management documentation, in policies and procedures. And for some of our clients that haven't developed, a model risk management program, they've started to. They've started that process of getting that up and running with it, because as we're going to talk a little bit later, that model risk management is going to be very helpful as you're running parallel, or you're selecting your vendor, depending on what stage you're in at this point. Or maybe you've adopted already, right? Because you were one of the early adopters. And that, again, model risk management is going to be really helpful here, because you're going to want to look to make sure that there's a formalized assumption review and approval of these, the same way you would on interest rate risk, and understanding the monitoring here, whether it's your quantitative approach, any exceptions, define your thresholds that are being utilized here. So that brings us to our first polling question. Where is your institution at in the CECL adoption timeline? You've already adopted, running parallel, selected a method and working on implementation, deciding what method to use, or maybe you're still a holdout and hoping CECL goes away. I know some people would like that. So looks like we have a good mix here. Seems like the majority right now is running parallel. A handful of people have already adopted, and there's also another handful that's still, they've selected a method, they're working on the implementation here. And then that's these, polling results are pretty consistent, across the board with our clients and what we're seeing.
For that one person who's hoping it goes away, I think we would love to have a call or a meeting. Maybe we can get together and get a plan started. I don't think it's going away, but we can always hope. Oh, my apologies, David.
So documentation, as auditors, as validators, we love documentation. We want to see it. We want to understand it. Documentation is going to be the key to, as you work on whether you're running parallel with it, or you're preparing to run parallel, as we talked through in the last poll. And I know Joe, later on in his presentation, when he talks about the validators, he's gonna come back to this whole documentation thing. So documentation, we want to make sure that the model is accurate, it's robust, it's stable, it meets your financial institution. It's that you understand the data going in, the data coming out, you're understanding, the limitations of the system, because when validators come in, they're going to be asking about this. They're going to say, okay, well, walk me through your system. Let me understand, walk us through the data inputs here. Walk us through the limitations of the system. And this is a thing where if you haven't formalized your model risk management, if you've been thinking about starting it, this is really, having model risk management is really going to be helpful here. If you're running parallel and you have model risk management, they should be involved in the process. Involve audit early on in the process with it, is what we're seeing. Think about your qualitative adjustments, and we know that your qualitative adjustments to historical information is inherently subjective and complex. And what we're seeing with our clients when they're making adjustments, when they're making their qualitative adjustments, is that because of the level of judgment that's being applied by management, we would expect that management has adequate documentation for supporting management's collection and evaluation of that data to demonstrate its basis for the adjustment. The less objective and more qualitative in nature that the adjustment is, just simply meaning that it's less quantitative support, the greater the need for robust documentation.
Yeah, and David, I'll just jump in. I think you're 100% correct that we do love documentation. It's something that we look for. It's something that it's just part of our day to day, right? We, I guess inherently through our job, we love to see it, and we understand its importance, which is I think the root cause of it. But when we talk about model validation, and I know you have some, we have a slide upcoming, but if I can just kind of put in my 2 cents, when we talk about model validation, the review and assessment of it by those in the audience is a critical ingredient. So the review, the documentation that supports what you have done in that area of development and implementation and use of the model, in my opinion, in my experience, is sometimes overlooked or underestimated. Maybe better said, it's just not prioritized enough relative to its overall importance. I think that documentation will be placed on an even more prominent pedestal with regard to CECL. I say that because just given its, well, obviously its newness, right? For lack of a better word, but also understanding the sensitivity of its effect on financial reporting. And that's going to come with it heightened scrutiny by third-party reviewers. So therefore, high quality documentation really just becomes more paramount and just that much more important in my eyes. In general, a lack of documentation is always a red flag, right? I think it's an easy ding for any exam team. The first thing they might do is, look at the documentation, right? Because they want to understand your process. They want to know, did you have a process? What was it? Was it followed? Was it robust? Did it cover the appropriate areas? To get really the understanding of what unfolded before they walked in the door. So the documentation, in addition to capturing all the assumptions about model data, usage, its purpose, et cetera, it's also going to identify, the various feeds, the various data sources, and it's going to document the business case which supports the use of the model, which we'll talk more about, I believe in later on in the presentation. But that's an important piece of documentation, understanding what the business case was to support the use of the model. At the end of the day, documentation should really convey an understanding of the model limitations, the model assumptions, and validation should ensure that judgment was exercised both in model design, model construction, and model use. I guess if you step back a little bit further and you think about documentation, what is the point of it, right? It should really enable a third party to step in and to be able to more or less replicate the model development and model use, or to understand the model development and model use. So you should be able to manage and measure model risk through your documentation. It also needs to be comprehensible by, when we talk about a third party, that third party can either be a technical or non-technical audience. So the documentation should be written in code, right? It should be written in plain English. We understand that validation is complex and it involves some, difficult areas, algorithms and codes and logic and conceptual soundness. But the documentation should really be understandable to a third party who's not a technical, model validator or data-centric individual. Some important considerations for documentation that I want to make sure we mention: a clear articulation of the business purpose, which we did discuss, a comprehensive discussion of the model history, a thorough review of academic or professional research relative to the model. Now for CECL, that history might not be there yet, but there should be some type of research that you should be able to obtain to support the model. And over the years, I'm sure more and more academic professional research will be there. And understanding, this is another important aspect, an understanding of the estimation results, which includes comparisons, if possible, to challenger and candidate models. And lastly, a detailed analysis of any testing that was conducted to support the choice of the champion model as opposed to a challenger or candidate model. The documentation, while it's going to support the use of a specific model because of several reasons, right? You can have a whole litany of reasons. Another important aspect of documentation is to understand limitations. So it's okay to list potential weaknesses. I actually think your exam teams are going to want to see that, because they're going to want to understand, they're going to want to know that you truly understand your model to the fullest extent possible. And part of understanding a model is knowing where there are potential weaknesses. I think sometimes we're a little bit timid or afraid to kind of speak to weaknesses. But in my experience, I think it gives you more credibility. With all that said, model documentation should err, right? We should be on the side of caution. We don't want it to be excessively lengthy, sort of kind of how I am right now, being excessively lengthy. So it doesn't need to be voluminous. It doesn't need to be a novel, but you should be able to show your due diligence. And really the only way to do that is going to be through your documentation.
I just want to quickly piggyback off of something that Joe brought up. I know that we, struggle with identifying weaknesses, especially with a model. And, we're afraid the auditors or the validators are going to come in and, kind of just ding us if we start identifying some weaknesses here. But I mean, between audit and the validators, we're here to help, We're here to help make sure that your system, your model is running that the way that you intended for it to run. So think of it more as a partnership when you get that model validated or you're preparing for that validation. Again, just to hone in here just a little bit more and quickly too about model documentation, because I'm sure everybody on the call is like, oh, great, more talk about model documentation. But understand that model documentation is not necessarily vendor documentation. You know, whether let's say you're thinking of or you're utilizing Abrigo, Moody's Analytics, or Oracle here, or one of the other CECL vendors. They're just the most popular ones that I've seen across our clients utilize. That the documentation is going to vary, and so is the quality across the different vendors. What I've seen across our clients is it's difficult to create cohesive documentation when there's a heavy reliance on that vendor support. And we've also seen that our clients are the institutions that have that model risk management program. We see that the documentation is more robust because they're used to it. And so if you haven't thought about, you know, developing model risk management, now is the perfect time, you know, to develop that and to work through that. And I know that this, so here, this is a little bit more funny when it's, you know, in person. So I don't know how funny this is going to be in a virtual format. But one of our clients was an early adopter of CECL, and they implemented their CECL model without a validation done. They went a full 2 years without a validation done. And then when audit came in and we talked to them about it, they turned around and they said, well, that's okay, we don't need a validation. And then they decided to debank. So it's, you know, important to, you know, to understand that the validators are here to help. And there is some really great guidance out there, you know, whether it's the SR11 or the FDIC Phil 2217, or even the OCC 2011-12, that will help with, that will provide some framework for your testing and your governance over models. So where do we go from here? Well, you know how Staples has that easy button? I think it's as easy as go out and if you're running parallel or you're starting to go out, you know, let's get your models validated here. At this point, I would like to turn it over to Joe, who's, you know, going to provide some additional information for consideration, and kind of talk through that whole validation process and what it looks like. I guess just one last thing actually before, because I forgot to before I turn it over to Joe. What I see with most of our clients is an annual validation. So CECL, it is the most significant estimate on your financial statements. This model is going to be a tier 1. It's a high risk model. So what we are seeing is an annual validation from our clients, and as I mentioned during my portion of the presentation, is be prepared to answer those tougher questions during the validation process. Understanding your limitations, your inputs, and then if you validate, now or work to get it before you implement on January 1, that you'll have plenty of time if there's any issues that are identified for remediation, so that we can help you after we validate your model. And again, that it's just the model documentation. It as Joe mentioned, it should be like a blueprint, right? So we can, the validators can replicate your model. And I have one last thing before I go, or I turn it over to Joe. Our next polling question here. So, how is CECL adoption going to impact your financial statement restatement? Increase reserves, decrease, relatively staying the same, or maybe you're just looking to us for the answer. So we'll give everyone a few minutes to answer the polling question.
Yeah, I don't know if D is an option. At least not for today. We haven't worked that into the slides.
Okay. Well, almost split here between an increase and relatively staying the same, and that's on point with that's on point with what we've seen across our clients. So I am really a man of my words. So I am at this point officially turning it over to Joe. And finally, so thank you, everyone.
Thanks, David. Okay, so conceptual soundness. What is it? We hear this term thrown around a lot in the model validation space. Some of you on the call might have a really good grasp of what that really means. Some not so much. So again, like, what does that mean? So I have to admit, I know I was billed as a validation expert, but I thought, hey, why not work smarter instead of working harder? So I have to give credit to Google here, because I went to Google and I literally typed in what is conceptual soundness. So I thought it was interesting. In logic, or more accurately, in deductive reasoning, this is per Google, an argument is sound if it is both valid in form and its premises are true. Within mathematical logic, which is probably more applicable to what we're talking about here today, logical systems are sound if and only if every formula that can be proved in the system is valid. So that kind of spoke to me, and I was able to relate that back to my world in the model validation space. So this is what we're proving out when we validate your model. Is it sound? Are the arguments, AKA the assumptions, true? Or are the formulas configured correctly? We perform testing to assess, the configuration, the settings, the reasonableness of your model, and whether or not it's functioning as intended. Overall, the objectives of conceptual soundness are to assess the quality and assess the quality of your model's design and construction. Also the implementation and the use, right? We want to review the documentation. Again, there's that famous word. We want to review the documentation and any empirical evidence that supports the model. We'll also look to assess any assumptions and limitations known within the model, or that are incorporated into the model. Overall, we're evaluating the reasonableness of the data that's fed into the model, that's interfacing with the model. So that, plus just really testing that actual interface of the system, of the data into the system. So that's kind of the groundwork for conceptual soundness, and what we are doing as a model validation team to test that conceptual soundness. Think of that as your foundation of any building, right? You have to have a strong foundation. If not, everything will eventually crumble. And that's how I view conceptual soundness within the scope of model validation. The starting point in reviewing model development is really understanding the theory and practice that underlies it. We touched on this earlier. There has to be a clear business case that supports your decision to implement or to embark upon your model. In the case of CECL, because we want to bring this back to CECL as much as possible, it's pretty straightforward, actually. The business case, it's going to be based upon accounting requirements. So, you can blame the FASB there. It's also going to be based upon supervisory guidance, and I'm sure in the following years, some interpretation. It's also going to be based upon your own credit risk management policy considerations, which are constantly being shaped and reviewed and modified as things change and time goes on. So getting back to David's point, the whole set it and forget it idea, that goes out the window. And there's a few other points that I'll make on in the presentation that also speak to that set it forget it mindset not being applicable. The next critical element for conceptual soundness is a review of relevant research. This can be done in conjunction with industry practice. In the case of CECL, we do know that research might be limited when you compare that to credit risk in general. As a consequence, we would recommend that you rely more heavily on your peer bank practices. And how do you understand that, right? So those can be comprehended through participation in events like this, right? In industry associations, webinars, workshops. So getting together with your fellow peers and talking and kind of training together and understanding what each is doing, their pain points, how they're dealing with them, best practices, whether it's learned or it's through experience working with their different regulatory teams possibly. All of that comes into play. You have to really grasp at every resource that you have out there, knowing that this is like a new endeavor. If I didn't mention already, looking up benchmark study exercises, things like that. Thinking about the model and the mechanics of your own CECL model, it's crucially important that your model is able to be comprehended by various stakeholders, such as different lines of business or your regulators, right? So how are your regulators going to understand your model, right? Well, you have to be able to give them the understanding. You can't expect that they're going to walk in and say, oh, I've seen this model before. I completely understand how it works, and yeah, we can skip that part. No, you have to be able to demonstrate to them that you understand the model. Obviously, models come in all different shapes and sizes and complexities, and again, this is something we'll talk about. But there's a fit for your institution. It's a matter of understanding what that fit is, whether it's extremely complex or it's more on the less complex side of things, finding that right fit for you is an important consideration. But again, understanding the model and being able to demonstrate that understanding is key. And no better way to do that than through your own documentation. So as we move along through the agenda, oh, yep, here it goes. We have another polling question. Question: how confident are you in the conceptual soundness and data being used, I'll assume, in your model? A, very confident. B, confident. C, not so confident. And this might depend on where you are on your CECL timeline. If you were an early adopter, I'm hoping that you would be very confident or confident. But again, I think depending on where you are with your timeline, that could be a factor on how confident you are with your model, with your data, with your conceptual soundness overall. Great. Yeah, so I mean, it's really interesting to see. It's, you would expect most responses to fall into that confident bucket. But to me, it's an interesting takeaway that there are some folks out there that are to this day still not confident. So that to me speaks to the need for independent for model validators to kind of be that sounding board and to help you cross the threshold so that you are confident. Okay. Model data it's kind of it's a very overarching topic because when it comes to validation, the data is really the crux of everything. I mean, it has a hand, or it has a part in everything we're doing, nearly, from a model validation perspective. So key consideration is always going to be review of your model data. Tying this back to one of the things that David mentioned, the representativeness of the data that supports your model and the estimates that are coming from your model for your portfolio of credit are super important. So what do we mean by the representativeness of data? David mentioned that we are in an expansion phase, or we have been for quite some time. Things are obviously changing, and the landscape is moving under us right now. Obviously, I'm no economist. I don't put myself out there to be. I have not slept at a Holiday Inn Express recently, so I can't even say that. But I can say that it's pretty well known that we have been in a certain period economically for a long period of time, relatively. So how does that affect your data? Well, your data could be skewed, right? Depending on how much data you have. If your data does not extend into a different life cycle, if it's all confined within that expansion cycle, you have a heightened risk of exposure, or you have a heightened risk of possible underestimating, overestimating, whatever the case might be, depending on the life cycle. You don't have a varied, well stratified set of data. So common sense, the more data you have, the more representativeness you have within that data, and the less likely it is that risk is lying within your data, right? Because you have just a bigger source, a bigger data set, and obviously from a model validation practice, that's a plus. And we know that the data might not always be available for the period of time that you would like. So again, this gets back to looking at your industry. So what are the benchmarks? What can you receive industry data to help you bridge that gap? And it's a challenge, right? It's a challenge to make sure that your data is not overly sampled from a stress period or a non-stress period. If your model is deemed to only work well for certain ranges of input values or market conditions, they really should be monitored, more closely or maybe more frequently. So to identify situations where these constraints on the data are being approached, and whether or not those situations are negatively affecting your data output or your model. Maybe it's deteriorating quicker than expected based on the data. Overall, an assessment of data quality is always going to be critical. In terms of how data would rank among the other considerations, like we talk about documentation, we talk about conceptual soundness, we talk about periodic validation or calibration. I would think most people would identify your data as the most important consideration. In my opinion, even more so when we're speaking about CECL, because CECL is, you're going to be directly affecting financial reporting, both the balance sheet and the income statement. So to me, there's a heightened risk there. And I think with that heightened risk comes the increased scrutiny that we mentioned a few slides ago. Big picture, if your data is really not well represented, again, it could lead to, as I said, quicker deterioration and eventually possible model failure. So nobody likes to see that, right? None of us want to, even the model validators, I'll be honest, we don't want to come in and say your system is not valid. That just creates headaches for us. But again, we can only go off of what we have in front of us. And I know we do our best to work with our clients to, to help them mitigate and to, not leave them so open for scrutiny and risk. But there's only so many things we can do as an independent third party. But I'm sure no one in the audience member is in that boat. So I think we're okay there. When preparing for this, I came across a research study, and I just thought it was interesting because it spoke to the availability of data, and then it really spoke to the importance of the quality of data over the quantity, which is kind of probably really good to hear if I were sitting in your shoes, right, to understand, well, what's the weight of the quality of data versus the quantity of data if we're in an environment, if we are in this environment where the quantity of data is not always predictable, or we can't attain what we would really like to have. So long story short, this theory or this research study was looking at a predictive model, and the analysis showed that for this specific model, which I think was looking at commercial loans, there were two inputs, two main data sources that were loan to value and credit score. And just off of those two factors alone, with nothing else, they had a nearly 70% confidence level. So pretty high for two factors. What they also saw was that with the addition of two additional factors, that went from nearly 70% to above 90%. So with the mere addition of a few factors, it went up very high. And from there you saw diminishing returns, of course, but I think it really spoke to the importance of the quality of your data over the quantity. In a perfect world, we would love to have both, but can't always have that. If you're looking at the supervisory guidance and I'm trying to understand how your role as an ongoing, as it pertains to ongoing monitoring, your monitoring of the system, along with your independent third-party validator, it's going to include process verification, which is a key component of any model validation. Process verification is essential to evaluate whether changes in product exposures, activities, your clients, different macroeconomic factors, AKA business and regulatory environment and just your economic environment, if they are giving you exposure, right? Or if they are necessitating the need for a replacement of your model, or a calibration of your model beyond its original scope. As Dave mentioned again, this is not a set it and forget it mindset, and we can't really just walk away from it. Process verification checks that all model components are functioning as designed. We're talking about verifying internal and external data inputs. We're also talking about sensitivity analyses and other checks for, data robustness and stability. Making sure that we are repeatedly, checking and testing the system. So a lot of this is emphasized during model development, but it's really important as well to kind of keep this mindset even while you're using the model when it's live, because just because we were able to attest to the conceptual soundness and to accurate data and to appropriate data interfacing into the model, it's not as though things will always be that way, because as the business is changing and as assumptions or inputs are being modified, you really have to kind of keep up with your system. Okay. So moving into estimation, as we know, the key difference between incurred loss and CECL is that forward-looking perspective, as opposed to looking over our shoulder into the past. Therefore, estimating lifelong credit loss depends on a strong foundation of data and models that are underpinned by these core drivers of credit risk. Your validation activities are going to be designed and executed to follow the various model risk management and governance frameworks, and by doing that we will test the foundation and the results of your model. Given the focus of accuracy and unbiasedness, it's critical within the context of CECL that the results do not evidence, again, that over or under prediction of losses. We also want to highlight the importance of code review in conjunction with the assessment of estimation as part of the overall model validation. Sorry if I'm moving my hands a little bit. Sorry if that's distracting. That's right. Sorry, code review. So not only the replication of estimating the results from the system, but critically looking at the structure of the code and the quality of the algorithms. Is the code well organized? Are the algorithms robust, and are they reasonable? The risk of estimation error due to the complexity of data, technology, and operation controls can be heightened when using models that employ AI or machine learning. So again, understanding what you need for your institution. Do you need an overly complex model, or can you work just well with another model that perhaps doesn't come along with all of the AI and machine learning? Obviously, it's going to be easier to possibly document and or explain your models if they are less complex. So I would think as your institution scales up and your model risk management team scales up, and perhaps you have more separation of duties within your team and the framework of your institution, then that complex model becomes more palatable. But if you're more of a if you're on the smaller side and you're a community bank and you're like you wear all the hats and the resources are limited, then I think you have to really think through what's a good fit for you. Of course, with the more complex models, there's always a risk of not fully understanding the process that leads to the estimate. Many models have a black box or are more proprietary in nature. With that, I think you're obviously going to need to overcome that. And again, that doesn't always necessarily lead to, it's not always a success, right? It's not a one size fits all. And we even see, I think, in the validation space for DSA, which historically that's where most of the validations have really came from. Recently, not so much, because again, we're looking at different models and now like the CECL wave. But it's interesting to see that, the black box algorithms and those more proprietary models, to me, there's a heightened risk of having the set it and forget it mindset, because maybe they're not always as understandable, or maybe you can't get the training you need on it, and it's harder to learn or to teach the system to yourself. So I just mentioned this just to say that it's definitely not a one size fits all. There's not going to be any. I would be shocked to kind of find exam teams or regulators criticizing you for using a specific model, right? As long as you're able to kind of understand and document that model and show why it worked for you and prove that business case or that use case, you should be in a good place. So I think one thing we can all probably agree on is that model validation is inherently complex and can be very technical. As such, the responsibility and decision-making is often delegated to senior management and or specialists. So, feel free to drop a comment in the chat if that sounds familiar. But nevertheless, for those directors and officers or senior executives in the audience, you will certainly need to understand some important and general principles about CECL model validation, or the processes that are used by your organizations. You'll have to understand what management is doing to address validation, whether it be through communication at risk committee, audit committee, or otherwise. And that kind of is par for the course, I think, with validation in general. But with everything else, I think it's even more heightened with CECL, because it's the new thing, right? So you're going to be questioned. Expect the hard questions. Be prepared for them. Don't be caught off guard. While I think your exam team, your exam team is going to want you to succeed, right? So just, I'm sure we all want to see the CECL implementation, for across the board for the industry kind of go off successfully. It's obviously been delayed. And I think the benefit you'll have is, you might have a team that's more willing to kind of work with you. But I think you have to give them the benefit of the doubt, or you have to give them a reason to give you the benefit of the doubt. You have to show that you're doing everything you can, whether you're senior management or you are a director, appropriate for your level to implement the system, to understand the system, to make it successful. Okay. So we'll move on from estimation, and we have another polling question, our fourth of 5. What is your plan for validating your CECL model? Already validated, you're in pre-implementation, or I'm sorry, you're going to validate pre-implementation. C, you're going to validate post-implementation, or D, like David's client, no plan. We'll just debank. Give everyone a few seconds to get their answers in.
Man, Joe, we've given the audience some really tough polling questions here. I thought we were going to take it easy on them.
We have. I feel like it's like that feeling when you're taking an exam for a certification. There's 3 good answers. Okay, so really happy to see that the majority are validating pre-implementation. So again, that's a business decision. We obviously would err on the side of validating pre-implementation. But there could be factors in play for different institutions to make that decision. But yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So with periodic calibration, why, right? Why are we, this, to me, this speaks to ongoing monitoring. So we understand that changes in markets, products, economy, some of the changes that I've already mentioned can affect your model's performance. As such, everyone in the audience should be conducting a periodic review of your model. You want to make sure that you can verify that it's working as intended, and that it's operating effectively. Generally, it's good practice to perform this review initially, so before the go live date or during the pre-implementation period, and then as a best practice to do this annually. Again, we see a lot of different model validations in other areas, and depending on the client, they have different plans. So not everyone is validating, other high-risk models on an annual basis. But I think once you cross a certain threshold, that's something that becomes expected. And I think with a CECL model, it's going to be in your best interest to kind of think through that plan critically. And again, best practice for us, we would not recommend anything less than annual at this point. So that validation period, that frequency, it could evolve and it could eventually stabilize, I would expect, depending on other material changes or conditions that could occur in the industry, in the economy, overall, kind of those economic factors that we've been mentioning. While your short-term model performance is almost guaranteed for your model, it's important to confirm their long-term stability, which is why we periodically review, right? So we can come in and we can validate, but it's a snapshot. It's a period in time. You think about your balance sheet. It's a period in time. So to me, that's model validation. It is a period in time. We conclude, we assess whether or not it's valid, not valid, valid with exceptions. However you rate your models, right? We can adopt to whatever that rating scale is, and map it back to the guidance, and to understand where you stand at that point in time. But then time goes on, and you're going to want to kind of continually assess that. Model validation and periodic review should identify if your model is sensitive to minor shifts in the underlying population of customers or transactions, while all the while ingesting a wide range of behaviors from your customers. Traditional techniques that we can use to test the robustness include sampling, cross-validating data sets, stratifying the population to kind of really drill down into the data. No one has the crystal ball, but the direction of future versions of a model, of your model, will always be based upon a combination of considerations informed by what? Informed by your validation observations and recommendations. So again, we're as third-party validators, we're trying to give you that value so that you can better predict going forward, what do we need to be looking out for? What's an issue for us? Is the model a right fit? Things like that. The direction of future versions that you will use as an institution will also depend on your monitoring outcomes and your reporting outcomes, and of course, user feedback. So the real user in your institution, how do they feel about the system? They're going to know the inner workings of the model and how it really relates to your specific situation. So we want to make sure that you're weighing all of these considerations in light of, the cost benefit of redevelopment or re-implementation of a new system, and your business needs. Okay. So we'll move into, I believe, our last slide, not counting questions, polling questions, which I believe we have one more, which, yeah, that's later. Okay. All right, so why validate? During the presentation, I know David and I have tried to cover, the CECL model validation perspective from a few different angles, and, sprinkling in our thoughts and our recommendations on model validation, why it's important, specifically how it relates to CECL. And, again, as that third-party independent model validation expert, what we see, and, sort of what we're hearing from our clients and prospects, as it pertains to CECL, but not only from our clients and prospects, but also from the exam teams. And, we train up on this just like everyone else does, right? Because we have to be prepared for CECL. We have to be ready, and, depending on who we're working with and where they are in their implementation process, we have to be able to support them. So again, I think for this why validate slide, we talk about short term, we talk about long term, and we talk about like a strategic opportunity. But I guess just in more general terms, whether or not your CECL model is developed in-house or acquired externally, the validation should be performed by those who are not involved in the model development's use and who do not have a stake in your model's outcome. So that's just something to just get out there, just to be aware of, as I'm sure many of you are. But first and foremost, make sure that you're truly independent. And independent does not have to mean you're dealing with a vendor, right? We are a vendor, but independent has a different meaning, and that's defined in the guidance. Whether or not you have that person in-house or that group in-house who has the expertise is, that's another question, and that could vary. So the independent party has to have the thorough understanding of the new CECL standard, and they should be familiar with the relevant business lines and loan products that are being modeled. You want to have a diverse team. You want to have specialists who can get the job done. Obviously, by not validating the models, you run the risk of criticism and, of course, fines and penalties. Supporting this year's parallel run, model validation is going to be a critical part, and it's going to support your parallel run. So in conjunction, those two are working together. Your model risk management teams should be providing you with effective challenge, specific to CECL requirements. Challenges could include reasonable, and supportable conclusions that are shaped by, could be portfolio segmentation, and different analytics, reversion to the mean, techniques such as that. At the end of the day, if you're not able to defend your model and the components of your model from end to end, it won't be a successful launch. Again, you want to be able to defend your model against those tough questions, and the only way to do that is to understand your model. And the only way to demonstrate that understanding, aside from just speaking to it, obviously, would be, what do you have on paper? What's your documentation? What have you done? What's your due diligence? Long-term, what you're learning from the validation process as we move forward with CECL is only going to benefit you and your model governance framework across the institution. So the usage and the convergence around CECL is going to lay the foundation for the bank, for the credit union, for your institution, It's going to help you, develop your data, develop assumptions, understand assumptions across all different models. And of course, the parallel testing that's likely happening today or has happened in the past or is yet to happen is going to give you that opportunity to fine tune your own specific governance around models, so that hopefully you have smooth quarterly disclosures or quarterly reporting periods with high confidence levels in your estimations. A consensus for what's reasonable and supportable, that might be evolving, right? Or that might emerge after several cycles of reporting or audits and examinations. My advice is to be proactive with your auditors and regulators. I would take advantage, as I mentioned before, of what I hope is relative, their openness and their sort of, their benefit of the doubt approach, so to speak, right? Because of the current environment. I think all parties want to succeed, and that includes your exam teams. They want to see you succeed in meeting this new standard. So I would use this as an opportunity strategically to interact with them, to have a healthy dialogue, and invite them, invite your examiners, your audit teams, and into your thinking. Let them understand what you understand, and give them your feedback. And also receive their feedback for the design of your program. So again, I just think it's a good opportunity to take this moment to kind of show, across the board, the fact that, we're doing the right thing, and, here's what we've been doing, and here's what we're trying, and, use this opportunity to ask the questions, because, I'm sure there's a lot of questions right now that many people have in common. Finally, we don't have a choice, right? Explicitly stated, everyone can read the quote. You don't have the choice. It's something that's required, and while painful, possibly, it's something we have to go through. But I know in the end, we'll come out better for it. Polling question 5. Final question. If anyone does not know this, I'm going to say you don't get the CPE credit. We'll make that a new rule. That's an amendment to the agreement that Sal mentioned. Competitive Elderly Cycling League. That sounds pretty cool. We have a jokester, ladies and gentlemen. David, was that you?
I'll never tell.
Okay. Well, either way, we only needed to respond. It did not matter if you had the right answer or not, only that you responded. So at this point, we'll take some questions. I don't know if there are any questions. Ashley, I'm sure you've been monitoring the Q&A.
Yep, Sal has.
Yes, I've been answering diligently. There's about 5 answered questions in the question and answer, as well as there's 1 answer in the chat that came in. Ashley, do you know, can we unmute people to talk, or that we can't do that in this forum?
If someone wants to raise their hand and ask a question, we can allow them to talk. But otherwise, you can use the Q&A function or the chat.
All right, so I guess at this point, we answered all the questions that's open. I believe we addressed the questions from the that came in with the registration during the presentation. So if anybody wants to raise their hand or type in another question, feel free to do so. I'll give you a minute or so to see if anything comes in.
Yeah, and I would just say, if anyone has any questions that they think of later on, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to have the conversation and to think through it, because maybe it's a question that we haven't received yet.
All right, so it looks like we don't have any, so we're about right on time. So thank you all for coming, and stay tuned for our next webinar, and we'll be sending out what that topic is shortly and getting that on the calendar. So thanks, Joe and David, for the presentation, and everybody for attending.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.